Hey guys, coming to you from my backyard. It was just too nice outside today to not enjoy the outside, and we are ready for chapter 3, where we just left off for chapter 2. Brian had decided it was super smart to kick a bear, and the bear knocked him down towards the lake. And so he was thinking he needed a weapon for the bear, perhaps. So here we go with chapter 3. He decided he needed a stronger weapon, a larger bow. He thought of it as a war bow. He would need arrows, tipped with some kind of sharpened head. He had been hunting with wood arrows with fire-hardened tips, but all they did was make a hole. They didn't provide any cutting action, which he felt would work best with a stronger bow. He used a hardwood tree he found by the lake. It had straight branches with a slackish gray bark and seemed to have a snap to it that the other woods didn't hold. He spent one whole day cutting a long, straight piece of wood and skinning and shaping it with the hunting knife and his hatchet into a bow shape slightly longer than he was tall. He did not hurry, but kept at it with a steady pace, and by dark the bow was ready to dry. Arrow shafts took 2 days in the sun to dry once they were stripped of their bark, and he thought the bow might take 4 or 5. He took time to cut another straight limb and shape another bow, working by firelight into the night. It wouldn't hurt to have 2 bows, and if one broke, he had a backup. He had not hunted for 3 days now, but had eaten well of fool bird and rabbit on his last hunt, and he took time to take 2 fish from the pond and cook them before going to sleep, boiling them into a fish soup, which he drank, spooned, finger-picked until the bones were clean. That night it was cold enough so that the sleeping bag felt almost delicious, and just as he closed his eyes, it came to him, all the signs, all the little nudges. The cold would get worse. Summer was over. He would not get rescued. He had finally given up on it and no longer listened or looked for planes, and he was going to get hit with a northern winter. All of that came to him just as he started to doze, and it snapped him awake and kept him awake until exhaustion finally made him sleep. In the morning he awakened with the same feeling of urgency and spent the day cutting arrow shafts from the willows for his war bow and trying to reason out what he needed to do to get ready for the coming winter. He had no warm clothing or footgear. The sleeping bag was a good one, though not a true winter bag. It was effective to perhaps 20 above if used in a good shelter, but that was all he had, the sleeping bag, and he couldn't spend all his time just lying in the bag. He would starve and die. He would have to continue hunting, eating, living. He looked at the shelter with new eyes. He had repaired the damage the bear had done. He'd studied his home while stripping the bark from the 24 arrow shafts he'd cut for the war bow. 3 sides were of rock, and they were snug, but the side he had filled in with logs and limbs and branches was far from airtight. He could see through it in several places, and would have to be winterized. He could pack it with dead leaves or even cut strips of sod with the hatchet to fill it in, and make an insulated door by stuffing 2 woven frames full of leaves. The problem, well, he thought, smiling, one of about 1,000 problems, was that he didn't honestly know how cold it would get, or how much snow there would be, or what he could do to live. What would be available to hunt in the winter? He knew some things migrated, but he wasn't sure which things, or if even rabbits came out. Maybe they stayed inside brush piles or caves all winter and slept. Also, would he have to have a fire inside the shelter to stay warm? He shook his head and paused in scraping the bark off one of the shafts to look across the lake. Too much to know for right now, too much to do. In the trees on the other side of the lake, the leaves were changing. They must have been doing it for a week or more, he thought. Why didn't I see it? And now that he noticed it, he saw that in many other areas the leaves were changing as well, mostly gold, some shades of pink and red, scattered bits of color, and the sky over the lake was different as well. The soft summer clouds were gone, and where it was blue, it was a flat coppery blue, and where the clouds were coming, they were a slate gray, and they grew as he watched. Not in thunderheads as in the summer, towering and full of drama, but an almost ugly gray that was all one shade and expanded from the north to cover the sky as if pushed by a large hand. Even as he watched, the patch of blue he had seen at first was gone, and all the sky was gray, and he could smell rain. Again, not the rain of summer, but a cooler, almost cold rain was coming, and it made him shiver, though it had not started yet. He went back to his shaving on the arrow shafts, concentrating on the task at hand. Something else he had learned. Do what you can as you can. Trouble, problems will come no matter what you do, and you must respond as they come. And indeed, he was having enough trouble with the idea of a war bow. It was all well and good to say he would have a more powerful bow, in the hope that a better weapon would give him more protection, but making one and the arrows was harder than he thought it would be. It all came down to poking a hole in something to kill it, he thought. That's what weapons were all about, whether it was a gun or a spear or an arrow. Something had to die for him to live, and the way to kill it was by poking a hole in it to make it die. He grimaced. But it was so. The hole had to be poked, the animal killed, and therein lay the difficulty with a war bow. It was one thing to poke a hole in a rabbit or a fool bird. They were small and thin-skinned. It was something else to think of doing it to a large animal. Once he had shot at a porcupine up in a tree with his light bow, thinking that if he could bring it down and skin it very carefully, he would get more meat and fat than he did off the rabbits and fool birds. He was amazed to see his arrow bounce harmlessly off the side of the porcupine. Oops. If he could not shoot a relatively small animal, what could be done to kill or even hurt a larger one? It was in the strength of the bow, he thought, and the type of arrow. The bow had to be so stiff it would drive the arrow much harder into a large animal to get deeper into a vital area, and the arrow had to have some way to cut through and make a larger hole. The stiffer bow he thought he had already made, though you'd have to wait and string it to make certain. But the arrows were a problem. He had stiffer shafts to make the extra load of a stronger bow, but the points were something else again. He thought on them long and hard all that night while working on the shafts by the fire. He considered the bits of aluminum scrap from the skin of the plane, but they were too thin and soft. There had been something, some place that could help him, and he couldn't make it come to his mind until after he'd gone to bed and was lying looking at the glowing coals of the fire. Pintner's sporting goods store. It was an old store that he sometimes passed on his way to school, run by an older man named Pintner, who had signed over the door that said he was anti-mall, and the store reflected it. There was none of the glitter or modernness of the mall, just some funky shelves and guns and bows and some hockey gear and an old oil stove where the unshaven men sat and talked about the old days and spit tobacco juice into old coffee cans. Brian had not been in the store that many times, but on one occasion he'd stopped there to see if Pintner sharpened ice skates, and next to the door there had been a large glass case with a collection of arrowheads arranged in a circle. He had stopped to study them and had thought then that it was a beautiful collection of intricately carved points, all laid out on red velvet, and he did not then, nor later, think of what they really were, tools for hunting. Only now, lying in his bag, looking at them in his mind, did it hit him just exactly what they were. Arrowheads, tips for arrows to make them punch holes. Some very small, some large and wide, and all of stone and all with sharp edges. Those people were the pros, he thought, the Native Americans who had made the points centuries before. They lived all the time as Brian was trying to live now, and they had experimented for thousands of years to come up with the designs of the heads. Brian closed his eyes and tried to remember how they had looked. When he had an image, he smoothed a place in the dirt next to the fire and drew 5 outlines that he thought he remembered correctly and tried to make them roughly the same size as the originals in the collection. 3 were small and he ignored them. 2 were quite a bit larger, and these he studied in his mind, pictures as well as the lines in the dirt. There could be only one reason for a larger arrowhead: to kill a larger animal. They worked that out, he thought. They found after thousands of years that a larger head killed a larger animal. All my research has been done. Now, he thought, all I have to do is find a way to make stone arrowheads. He searched his memory, what he had learned in school, seen on television, read in books, and nowhere could he find a picture of anybody saying how stone arrowheads were made. Well then, start with what you know. The arrowheads were made of stone, so find a stone that will work, he thought, and he went to sleep thinking of all the places around the lake where he had seen stones. In the morning he awakened famished, as if he hadn't eaten for a week. There were only 4 fish left in the fish pool and none on the line, which bothered him, and he ate 2 of the larger fish to take the edge off his hunger. He would have to hunt today to get meat and set the arrowhead problem aside. In mid-morning, after cleaning the camp and trying to hide the pot inside his shelter in case the bear came back, he set off to the north. In the months that he'd lived on the L-shaped lake and hunted the area, he'd come to know the surrounding region like a large yard. Except for predators, which ranged constantly looking for food, most animals seemed to stay pretty much in the same location, and because they started there, they tended to grow there. North about a half a mile, it was best for hunting rabbits. There was a large patch as big as a football field, where an ancient fire had burned the trees off and left brush. Rabbits had hidden there from the predators because they could escape into the thick brambles easily. Because they had come there and been able to live there, they had increased, as rabbits do. And now there seemed to be rabbits wherever Brian looked in the patch. It was unusual for him to go there without getting several good shots, and though he still often missed, he had worked out a ratio of 5 to 1. He seemed to get one rabbit for about every 5 shots on rabbits. The ratio was 7 to 1 on foolbirds. Although he had hit the last rabbit he shot at, he felt lucky, and he approached the brushy area with an arrow already knocked on the string. Things never happened as he planned, however, and because he was concentrating on looking for rabbits, he very nearly stepped on a foolbird. It blew up under his foot in a flash of leaves and feathers like a grenade detonating, and flew off at a quartering angle away into Brian's left front. Without thinking, he raised the bow, drew, and released the arrow, and was absolutely flabbergasted to see it fly in a clean line, intersect the flight line of the foolbird, and take it neatly through the center of its body. It cartwheeled to the ground, and Brian ran over to it. Though it looked dead, he broke its neck with a quick snap to make certain it was gone. Incredible, he thought. If I lived to be 100 and tried it 1,000 more times, I would never be able to do it again. Just a clean, reflexive shot. But more, he pulled the arrow out of the dead foolbird and wiped the blood off it and turned and walked back to the camp with the same arrow on the string. He took 5 steps and a rabbit jumped out from a bush on his right, and in one smooth action he dropped the dead bird, raised the bow, drew the arrow, and released it, and saw it take the rabbit through the chest at a flat run. It died before he could get to it, and he picked it up. That night he cleaned them both and made a stew, boiling them together, and ate the meat and drank the broth until he was packed full, his stomach rounded and bulging. 2, he thought. 2 with the same arrow, and both moving, and both hit almost perfectly. He took the arrow from the rest of them and propped it in the corner. That, he thought, is my lucky arrow. In the same instant, the word medicine came into his thought. It is my medicine arrow. He had not planned it, not meant to think the phrase, but it came and he knew it was right. It was not a religious idea, so as a way to believe in what he had done and how he had done it. And from that day on, he did not use the arrow again, but put it on a small rock ledge. When things were bad, he would look to the arrow on the ledge and think of how right it had been. 1 arrow, 2 kills, and a full belly, all in one day. That night before he went to sleep, as he lay in his shelter with the light from the fire coming through the opening, he took a stick of charcoal from the fire and drew what he had done on the rock wall above his bed. A stick figure with a bow shooting an arrow at 2 stick animals, 1 bird and 1 rabbit, and lines showing how the same arrow had taken both of them. When he was done, he shaded in the animals and the figure of the boy with the charcoal to give them body, working in the flickering light. He wished he had some color to work in as well, to show feathers and fur and blood. It was not until later, as he lay back just before full-bellied contented sleep, that he remembered having seen some pictures in a magazine of the cave paintings in France. Old, he thought. They were the oldest art ever found, according to the article, painted by early man. Brian burrowed down into the bag and closed his eyes, and the last thing he thought was to wonder if the ancient men who drew in the caves in France ever took 2 animals with the same arrow. All right, so that's the end of chapter 3. He's got this great bow and arrow now, and I want you to think about what can he do with that bow and arrow. What animals can he go after now that are going to help him especially prepare for winter? What kind of animal is he going to need to bring down in order to be ready for winter? All right, guys, answer that question, and I'll see you at chapter 4 soon.